All right, hey, welcome everyone. Thanks for bearing with me here. Yeah, technical difficulties, I don't know. My name is Keegan Campbell. I work at GitHub. My title is Senior Software Engineer. You're here for a talk called Zero to Open Source Contributor. So thank you for coming. Let's start here with a little introduction about myself. This is me. That's a picture from 2018. I don't take a lot of pictures, so if you look at my LinkedIn picture, it's like 7 years old. So a little bit about myself. I started work at Alaska Airlines after a pretty standard 4-year CS degree. I did 2.5 years there, and I worked on a lot of stuff, C# desktop applications. I worked on Swift iOS applications, and then I worked on like the back end to the Alaska Airlines shopping pipeline, which I have some fun stories about how I destroyed at various times. So we could talk about that after if you're interested. So started at Alaska Airlines. From there, I went to Microsoft. I was on a team called App Center, which was the result of an acquisition of a startup called Hockey App. I worked there for a little bit, and then I joined GitHub, which is where I'm at now. At GitHub, I work on the SDK team. SDK stands for Software Development Kit. Software. Don't have time to write development. And that is like a layer that sits on top of APIs. So if a company wants to publicly expose things to let others integrate with it, that's called a API actionable programming interface, something like that, something programming interface. And then the SDK is a convenience layer that sits on top of that. So your client code will add the SDK, and then that will talk to GitHub. So if you've ever heard of something called OctoKit or the GitHub Terraform provider, these are things that I work on. So part two, outside of random work history, like why am I up here talking about stuff? So because I work on OctoKit, a lot of my day-to-day life is reviewing open source PRs, encouraging the community, and then working with people to ship those improvements and keep the SDKs up to date. So I'm fortunate to be in a position where I have some amount of experience with open source. I'm fortunate to be in a position where I'm paid to do that on a somewhat daily basis. So I thought I'd get up here and I'd talk to you about what I'd like to see in open source contributions and how you can become successful contributing to open source even if you don't have experience doing it. I stumbled into a lot of this knowledge accidentally or slowly or clumsily, and I'm hopeful that I can help speed the process up for some of you. Cool. So what we're going to talk about today, I gotta like vandalize myself a little more here. What we're going to talk about today is a really basic background on open source. We'll keep this short. Hopefully you're familiar if you're attending an event called Open Source 101. Picking a project to contribute to is probably the single most important thing. Picking an issue to contribute to goes along with that. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that and strategies for how to be successful. Then we're going to take a break, or depending on the timing, we might do this like little lab submission thing before. We'll see how the timing works out, especially with the technical difficulties that we got a little delayed on. So this will be a like follow through or a follow along exercise. If you have a laptop, that's great. If not, that's totally cool. You can do this later or not at all. I'm not a cop. Then afterward, we'll talk about strategies for following up on your pull requests after you open it, do a little conclusion, do some Q&A. I went to the office 2 days ago and raided a bunch of GitHub stickers from the security desk, so then I'll give some stickers out. Maybe you want stickers, I don't know. Stickers are cool. Great. So also, if you have questions during this, please feel free to interrupt or raise your hand or whatever. If we're running out of time, then maybe I'll cut you off and punt it till the end. But for now, let's assume that we're all good, and please feel free to ask questions as you go along. Quick note about methods here. In general, I don't love slides. I tried to do this without slides. I experimented with like writing an outline as I went. I experimented with doing the whole thing like off my terminal or off my laptop. I find slides kind of boring, but it's also nice to, like, if you're taking notes, have something to latch onto and show like an outline of how this works. So what we're going to do is this like annotated slide deal. Yeah. Okay, cool. Another quick note about methodology here. I'm going to be using GitHub terms like pull request and issues. Everything here is broadly applicable across whatever source control system you use, whether that's GitLab or Bitbucket or what have you. There's nothing specific here that's like GitHub only. But we're going to be using GitHub terms. Okay, cool. So let's move on to open source overview. So just really basic background. Open source, I feel like the accepted community definition of when this thing started was at Bell Labs in the 1970s. There's an operating system called Unix that is the basis of what is modern day Mac OS, or if you're using a Linux machine like me, it's built on top of that. When Unix was first shipped in the 70s, they included the source code with it, which is kind of cool. And so you could see if you were developing on this, like what it was doing under the hood, and you could understand. And that was kind of revolutionary. Then we have closed source software companies that really didn't like that. There's this quote that I really like from an old Microsoft executive named Jim Allchin. I don't want to pick on Jim. He seems like a nice guy. He's retired now. He makes music. You can go listen to his guitar albums on Spotify or whatever. So that's cool. He's definitely living the dream. But in 2001, he said, quote, "Open source is an intellectual property destroyer. I can't imagine something that could be worse than this for the software business and the intellectual property business." Clearly, we've come a long way since then. Large companies like Microsoft are now giant open source contributors. They fund people like me to work on open source projects. And so we've seen this large about face to the current solution, or the current environment that we're at right now. You see figureheads of the open source movement. When I think of like people who are influential, the names that come to mind is probably like Donald Knuth in the 70s. I think that's how you say his name. He was a Stanford professor who's hugely influential. You have people like Richard Stallman, who kind of came on the scene in the 80s, building on top of Knuth's work. And then you have people like Linus Torvalds is who I'm thinking of, the author of Linux and the author of Git, who started becoming active in maybe the early 90s and is still very active today. Those are probably like three of the big names that I think about of influential people in open source, and they're definitely worth reading about and reading their works later. Okay, cool. So we have this title shift. This is evident probably most clearly in the amount of production code that it runs on Linux servers. GitHub, for example, like all of our servers, bare metal or in the cloud in AWS or Azure, are all like running Linux stuff. It's not like we pay for Windows licenses and like Microsoft SQL Server to run things like that. And you see sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Yes, basically everything in production is running on Linux. Even companies like GitHub, whose main code base is closed source, like you can't go just download like the Ruby on Rails app that's 90% of GitHub and then run that on your own machine. But even these types of code bases are an amalgamation of tons of open source projects. So even closed source projects, like you're going to, even if you exclusively work in closed source, you're going to be using open source projects. It's worth knowing about them and how to contribute. And it's still useful information. Like you're going to still be interacting with open source software. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit about, we don't need this slide. I already did everything up there. So why do you care? Like obviously you care a little bit if you're here sitting in this room, but like what can open source really do for you? Altruistically or selflessly, there is a couple reasons that I think this is important. One thing is you want to give back to the community whose projects you use. every person in this room definitely uses open source projects every day at some level of their stack. If you don't use Linux, maybe you have Android. Maybe you browse the web and read WordPress sites. Maybe you use sites that depend on like MySQL, the database. Maybe you use Firefox as your web browser. These are all like large name open source projects. And even if you don't use those directly, you definitely use them at some level of the tech stack because they support sites that you care about and you visit, and that I care about and that I visit. Even closed source applications rely on open source libraries under the hood. So you want to be able to give back to the community that's given us so much. Another thing is helping others can be its own reward. There was a keynote earlier that talked about warm, fuzzy feelings. I think that can occasionally happen if you're helping others and you contribute to open source. It makes me feel good. Hopefully it will make you feel good or has made you feel good in the past. That's sort of like a virtue as its own reward type thing. Maybe more interestingly, there is a lot of selfish reasons that you care about open source. Can I get a quick show of hands? Like if you're a student or like actively enrolled in school, can you raise your hand so I have some kind of idea? Okay, cool, thank you. If you are like currently early in career or like have a job and you're paid to write software or something like that, can you raise your hand? Okay, cool. Seems like a pretty even split. That's interesting. So thanks for going along with that. I'm bringing like all my biases about talks here, and one of those is anti-slides, and another one of those is I don't like when people ask the crowd for stuff. I've violated both those things already, so I understand why people do that now. Okay, so selfishly, why do you care about open source? Probably a big one is improve your skills. And we're gonna spell skills with a Z. Everybody that you work with online has a completely different exposure to software, a completely different set of biases, and a completely different perspective on things. And that is really valuable. That's something that you're not going to get like in an office with just you working, or if like your head's down on your own project and I don't know, like the guys that created Dwarf Fortress. It's like two guys in an apartment and they code for 10 years and then they churn out this project. That's not how open source works, and I think that's really valuable. Getting that exposure to other perspectives will help you grow your skills. Another selfish reason here is you can get real-world software development experience. So what you can do with open source is build a portfolio that you can show off. You can talk about it in interviews. Because open source is by its nature public, it's a great opportunity to show that you can work as a team, you can understand a project, you can break down problems and then come up with a solution and contribute. And these are awesome things to show off and talk about. Like I mentioned, if you're in interviews, you're trying to get paid more, talking about open source contributions is a great way to do that because you can just pull up like a pull request or something that you worked on and talk through the whole story. One other aspect of this is working in open source makes you better at the meta game, like getting good at software. In addition to just hard technical knowledge, like if I'm going to be a React contributor, I need to know the entire, like how the project is architected, but I also need to know like how to learn a project. And the more that you do that and the more that you interact with these open source projects, you get better and better and quicker at doing that. And that's a really valuable thing that's going to help you grow over the course of your career. There's nobody that works in software is going to like pick one language and one tech stack and be like, okay, that's it, I'm mastering this and I'm not learning anything else. Working in software means that you have to pick up new languages, you have to pick up new tech stacks, things come and go, and you will have to adapt in order to be effective in the industry. And working in open source is a great way to develop that skill. The last selfish reason I have for why you should care about open source is in a perfect world, you can fix issues you care about. There's a story, I don't know how true it is, or like a little anecdote or fable about a guy who interviewed and joined a company because he was a heavy user of their project, and then immediately fixed one bug that he cared about that no one else had paid attention to, and then submitted his 2 weeks notice. I don't know if that's true, but in a perfect world, you don't have to join a company to fix something that you care about, right? You can look at the bug and you can implement something that will help you and other people. So that's sort of like the end goal, the ideal state, is like you are confident and able to make changes that you want to change in public products that you use. Okay, cool. So let's move on from why should you care. Let's talk about the life cycle of an open source contribution. Now, there are repositories. This is also shortened to repo. This is a Git thing, not a GitHub thing. Everything will be called a repository. This repos have issues and PRs. This is a GitHub thing. Man, I should have put my timeout longer. Get big. Okay, cool. Your source control system of choice might not call them issues. It might be like defects or bugs or tickets or stories or what have you. There's a lot of different language that describes this, but an issue is basically like something that needs to change. And it's like a paperwork thing, like you're filing, hey, this needs to change, and someone will do something about it. And what you do about it is a PR. This is short for pull request. Other source control systems might call it a merge request or a change request or patch or something else entirely. What it is you're introducing new code to a code base. So usually, you might think like, why are issues separate from PRs? Why can't it just be one thing and you submit code that changes something? Issues tend to come at multiple levels. So you'll have an issue that's like a big, I don't know, GitHub will call it an epic or an initiative or something like that. And that represents some amount of weeks or months of work. And then underneath that, you have other issues. And maybe that represents like 2 weeks of work at that level. And then this is like 2 weeks. And then down here, you have really basic issues. And then that'll be like, I don't know, maybe a day's worth of work or something like that. And then normally at this level, there's a one-to-one correspondence between PRs and issues. So issues have multiple levels that are used to organize work. If you get, like if you're just one person, you can keep all of this in a notepad or like, you know, your own notes app or whatever. But when you're doing something collaboratively with other people that live in different places, it's important to have that paper trail and that sort of planning process, I guess, which is why issues and PRs are separate. Okay, cool. So you submit a pull request on a site like GitHub. That gets reviewed, it gets edited, and then it gets merged into the main code base. After that point, it will get released. And this release process depends completely on the ecosystem that you're using. For example, if you're like working on a project, like maybe you work on Redis or something, which is a popular key value store, maybe it's published in a Docker image that has to be built and then pushed to some kind of registry, like Artifactory or GitHub Container Registry or something like that. Maybe you're working in JavaScript on a library and that is published to the NPM registry. Maybe you're working in .NET and you put something in the NuGet gallery. So each ecosystem will have its own sort of like artifact stores and release process. If you're working with the language Go, you don't need any of that. It's like a pull-based thing, and if you can read the code, Go will download the module for you. So the release process is very like ecosystem dependent. Okay, so that's the life cycle of an open source contribution. There's a repository, somebody opens an issue, somebody opens a PR to close that issue, can be the same person, it's okay if it's not. That PR will get reviewed and merged, and then commits will get released at some point. Okay, cool. So let's go on to picking a project to contribute to. This, like I said, is the hard part. and this is something that like you're going to, like when I started out, I was like, oh man, I just want to contribute to open source. This is so cool. And then I was like, oh crap, how do I do that? It's super overwhelming. There's a ton of content out there. I don't know what I like. I don't know like even what I'm using. And it takes a long time and a lot of effort to find something that you can and want to contribute to regularly. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to pick a project to contribute to. As a little anecdote, I'm going to show my first PR here. I have notes. I have links. Okay, cool. So I was reading this site called Hacker News. Brian Douglas talked about this earlier briefly in his keynote. Hopefully you came from there. It's like a news aggregator, somewhat similar to Reddit, but it's focused on tech news. It's run by a startup incubator called Y Combinator, and it's like a good way to. There are differing opinions about like the quality of discourse on the site, but it's a good way to stay up to date on like industry trends and like new projects and things like that. So I was browsing this site when I was in college. I just got my fancy new GitHub account in 2016. And I saw this project called Triangulart. And it's like a little, I don't know, like a graphics thing. I'm not artistic, which is, I don't know, maybe you gathered that by my doodles earlier. But this is like kind of fun to play with for a few seconds. You can kind of draw stuff and like change your color, make this artwork out of triangles. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And I went to read the code because I wanted to understand how it worked. And what I did was I saw there's this really basic comment here where there was a class called leftbar that was immediately preceded by a comment called right. And then a class called rightbar that was immediately preceded by a comment called left. And I thought, I know what to do here. I can change this. And so I submitted this pull request. I said this very self-effacing, like, hey, please feel free to reject this. Like, I'm new to this process. I don't know what I'm doing, but I think this is wrong. And then the person was very nice, you know, gave me the thumbs up, merged it in right away. And I was like, cool, I made it. And that was gratifying. You know, it was fun to do that. Ultimately, though, it's a little unfulfilling. Like that was a trivial change, and I wanted to move on and make like, you know, maybe I could do a new feature and maybe I could do something different. Didn't work out for me with that project. Turns out I hate front-end stuff. I'm not talented at it. I like the back end. So I kind of dropped out of that project. I never submitted anything else to it. And it's okay to do that, I guess. Like it's okay to spray across a couple of projects, and it's also okay to build up to some deeper contribution. So that was my first time, and that was all about the triangles. In an ideal world, the project that you contribute to is something that you use frequently and something that you care about. Realistically, this is unlikely to be a good introduction. If you're very experienced and you use a lot of software and like you're very comfortable with your workflows and you know you've been in the industry for a while and you have a project that you're like, oh, this is great, I can totally contribute to this and improve my daily workflows, that's awesome. Lots of software tooling tends to be open source, probably because software people are nerds who like open source stuff. And so that's a great way to look. Like if you're, I don't know, super into Vim, maybe there's like a Vim plugin that you can edit or that you can write to help your workflow out. But that's not going to be like super easy if you're like a junior in college or whatever, or maybe you're a recent boot camp grad, or maybe you're self-taught. You're probably not going to go out and find a project that you like immediately use every day and that you're comfortable contributing in. So if you're not in an ideal world, let's talk about that. That's North and South America. Okay, so picking a project is somewhat dependent on what you want out of open source. And I'm going to split this into two main categories here for us to talk about. So one of them is like getting used to it. and I'm putting it in quotes because there's a number of things that this applies to. When you want to get used to it, you want to get used to your tooling, you want to get used to like the habits of contributions, you want to get comfortable with your terminal, your Git client of choice, your source control, site of choice. Maybe that's GitHub, and you want to get really used to like knowing how to use the tooling and understanding how to be effective. These are types of things that's like at the level of one way to get better at software is to just be like a better typer, right? It allows you to try ideas quicker and allows you to fail faster, and then you can learn quicker. This is sort of the same idea of like, if you understand your tooling really well, you understand Git really well, you understand GitHub really well, then you will be a more effective employee regardless, or effective contributor regardless of like the substance of what you're contributing, because you'll be able to just use it and try things so much faster. So that cycle of like getting used to stuff so you can fail fast is really helpful for learning. And if you want to do this, there's a number of things you can do here. There's a lot of toy contribution projects online that you can find. We're going to do a walkthrough of something like that today, where it's like really basic. We're just going to be editing plain text, but it's a way to get used to like contributing to a repository. Another thing you can do is make your own project. Maybe you use something like, if you use GitHub, there's a feature called GitHub Pages, where you get a domain for your site, that it's your username.github.io. So mine's KF Campbell. My initials are KFC, by the way. I guess my parents had a sense of humor. .github.io is the domain. And all of you who have a GitHub account like can create this repo that GitHub will host for you. So that's kind of fun. Maybe you want to set up a site, maybe you want to put your resume on there, maybe you want to write like a simple little game, whatever. Maybe you want to just practice basic HTML. Putting up your own site or like making your own thing is a great way to go about it. You can do things like solve problems. For example, deep in the history of my GitHub page, there's like practice interview questions that I had solved like when I was preparing for interviews a while ago. You can do something like, some people, whenever they learn a new language, will solve a problem in it that they like know how to do in another language, just to get familiar with it. For example, there's a problem called the 8 queens problem, which is like, how do you situate 8 queens on a chessboard such that none of them can attack each other? And there's a bunch of different solutions for this, but it's an example of an exercise that you can repeat in different languages. And maybe you want to save that, commit that, put that on your GitHub just to get used to this tooling and getting used to committing here. Another thing you can do when you want to get used to stuff is start a program with your friends, assuming you have friends that program. Maybe you don't, and that's totally cool. But like when I just graduated college, I want to say I was experimenting with mobile app development, and I'm from Seattle, baseball fan, so I wrote this application that used the OpenStreetMap API to give directions from wherever you were to Safeco Field, which is where the Mariners played at the time. Obviously, that has very little real-world value, but it's still fun to like, I don't know, you can pull this out of your pocket, show it to a friend, like, hey, look what I did, isn't this fun? And that sort of thing will give you a great amount of experience if you, practice writing that and then putting it on GitHub and collaborating with others. One thing that you can do to help this out is, like, on my phone, I keep a list of APIs that I find. Like, if I see a fun site, maybe it has like free weather data or free sports data. Free sports data is hard to come by. ESPN keeps that real close to the chest. But maybe there's other, services that you find out, like OpenStreetMap is one of them. There are public APIs. And one thing I like to do is just keep a list of those on my phone, and maybe I write some dumb app if I'm bored, or like, I don't know, pull some weather data from locations I care about and show it to me or something. Like, it's a way what I'd like to avoid in this getting used to it part is like writer's block, but the code equivalent where you sit down, you're like, I want to make a project, but I don't know what to do. Having some sort of notes or like projects that you can build off of is really useful for kickstarting that process. Another thing you can do along with this is keep programming ideas on your phone. I have a list of ideas on my phone of like, whenever I get bored or I want to do a project, along with the APIs, I also say like, I don't know, here's an idea for a dumb app I have, or once I tried to make an app that like when I threw my phone in the air, it would use the accelerometer to measure like how fast it was, and I wanted to put a leaderboard. That didn't work out so well, but keeping track of these dumb ideas is like a great way to get rid of that writer's block and start yourself in a position to contribute to open source. And it's also a good way to, like, I don't know, I think this stuff is kind of fun. If you're not having fun, you're probably doing something wrong. Back in the good old days when Twitter's API was open, I once wrote a bot to stream tweets and look for phrases like to win or retweet to win or whatever. And then it automatically performed that action and then would DM me when I got like mentioned or whatever. And so for a while I had like 2 pounds of sunflower seeds and this XXL t-shirt from a casino in Atlantic City showing up at my door that I never wore, and like all these like goofy random products that people were just doing giveaways on Twitter for. And that kind of thing, like keeping that spirit of like the joy and like just hacking on stuff is kind of, I think that's an important way to discover your passion and contribute to open source at the same time. Okay, cool. I'm running out of space here, but other things that you can look for, game jams are a great one. If you look online, like search online for game jams that happen, a lot of them are remotely, and it's like a hackathon, but focused on developing games. Everybody wants to be a game developer deep down. I think if you don't, you're probably lying to yourself a little bit. At least as a hobby, it's super fun. Another thing that you can do, if you have a GitHub account already, there's like a github.com/explore site where GitHub will chew through stuff that you've liked so far and spit out like, here's similar projects that you might like. Maybe that's something you do to find easy open source ways to contribute. By the way, I'll make these slides available later if you want to look at my terrible handwriting. Don't feel like you have to, I don't know, take pictures of this or anything like that. Okay, cool. So the other thing I think that you can get out of open source, or like the two main things that you can want, aside from getting used to it, is, oops, we already did that. Get comfortable tooling a process, is building a portfolio like we talked about earlier. In contrast to getting used to stuff, maybe you're not going to submit like a lot of surface level PRs to various projects in this way. The goal here is to go really deep in one application. And then when you do that, you'll be able to deliver contributions that build on each other, and you'll be able to know a project inside and out. And this is a really important skill that you need in the real world as well. You're going to get thrown into code bases, and you're going to have to learn how things operate, and you're going to have to build a bunch of contributions that build on each other in order to deliver like real features. That's just part of working in software professionally, and you can do that in open source as well in order to like practice or learn or get up there. What you want to be called is like a core contributor, as opposed to someone who fires off like one pull request to fix something they care about. A core contributor is someone who's like been around, is active in the community, and that's like a very valuable role to have, especially if you're working on building a portfolio. You want to show that you can go deep in a project and you can learn from your past mistakes and create commits that build on each other. Obviously, this is great, but it's difficult to find a project that fits this bill, and it's something you'll have to try again to do. So some strategies to look for this, like use your social networks. You can ask your friends what they're interested in, what they're using. Maybe if you're learning a specific technology like React, you can go to the React code base and look at how it's architected, try and fix some bugs that way. You can also read tech news. Flashback to my little anecdote about the comment change. Maybe you do that, but maybe you actually stick with the project and go deeper. That's a good way to identify projects that are like sort of up and coming. Like Brian Douglas talked about earlier in his keynote, there's his company OpenSauce has like a aggregator of projects that are popular, but like just getting off the ground, and you can more easily jump into those and have a deeper level of contribution than you could be like if you're cloning the Chrome code base or Chromium for the first time and like there's thousands and thousands of lines of junk. Okay, cool. Another way to do this, to find projects that you can contribute to more deeply, is user groups. If you're here, that's a great start. It's awesome to meet people that are interested in software. People like talking about their interests. Ways you can find stuff is like meetup.com or similar sites will occasionally have, like, I don't know, there's this organization called Seattle Code Crafters, I think, that I've gone to meetups occasionally at that I just found off meetup.com. And talking to those people is a great way to identify projects. Okay, cool. So those are like the two focuses, I guess. What do you want out of open source? If you're just getting used to it, these are great options. If you're looking for something deeper to build a portfolio, what you want to do is identify a project or two and get really, really deep into them. Okay, what time is the break? 11:30, okay, thank you. Cool. Okay, so let's talk tips for picking a project. Familiarity is best. One thing that I've tried and failed at a lot is like, don't learn a language and like a platform and a new code base at the same time. For example, it's unrealistic if you've never used JavaScript before to jump into React, learn React, and then like contribute to a project that uses React. If you are good at a language, I would start by looking for projects in that language so you can isolate like one, variable, I guess, and then be able to focus and learn that. This sounds kind of obvious, but I've tried this a lot and it doesn't work, at least for me. Maybe it would for you. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of online aggregators for this. You can look at stuff like OpenSauce. You can look at, there's a GitHub topic search, which is pretty interesting. I think it's github.com/topics. Thank you. And this is a fun way to look at, you can filter this by languages that you know. You can filter it by interest. Maybe you're like really into machine learning and you want to contribute to something that way. That's a good way to do that. And then this is some content that was also covered in keynotes, but events like Hacktoberfest is a great way to get involved with new projects. And that's nice because culturally, Hacktoberfest, a lot of projects like update their contributing documentation and like have a lot of good first issues and support newcomers more than they would otherwise. Software community is not always the most welcoming place, but looking for events that are explicitly targeted around that are great. Okay, so Hacktoberfest, maybe you want like Google Summer of Code is another one. Summer of Code, wow, that is illegible. There are contests that you can find, like Red Hat used to run an open source contest. I don't know if they still do that, but there's things like Advent of Code, where it's kind of a social thing. Advent of Code is like the first 3 weeks in December, I think. There's a new problem that's released every day. They start out pretty easy and get more and more complex. This is a great way to like meet people that are interested in similar things, collaborate with solutions, and maybe you have a relationship that goes on past that. There's one other thing I'm missing. Oh, online aggregators. I feel obliged to mention there's a GitHub employee named Kay Daigle, or Kyle Daigle. He's like a fancy VP now, but he used to just be a regular person. And he has this treehouse course called How to Pick an Open Source Project. That is another good resource that I would lump under online aggregators. Treehouse course. Okay, cool. So let's talk about picking a project part 2. Join social stuff is really important. One thing that GitHub does is there's not like direct messaging, and there's discussions, but it's not like a community forum. So a lot of projects will have like Slack, they'll have Discord, and they'll have other aspects of, other social stuff that you can look at and join. And this will allow you to talk to maintainers. People love talking about their interests, especially kind of niche stuff like software that a lot of people don't pay attention to. If there's a social aspect to the project, definitely join that. People will be understanding and they will help you get started. For example, there's a software I use called Obsidian. Obsidian is like a note-taking app, and the creators of the app have a Discord, and they're super, super active in there. And they will respond to questions about how to integrate with how to use the plugin system and like various open source aspects. That's a great example of how joining a social group, I suppose, can start you off. One difficult aspect to open source is everything is kind of by nature asynchronous and like written based and spread out. You're going to be doing a lot of self-directed learning. In a job, you can go to someone who knows more than you and be like, hey, I don't know anything about this. Please teach me how to do this. And you can't really do that with open source software just straight on GitHub, but you can in social channels like Slack or Discord. So that's a great way to remove some of those unknowns or the barriers preventing you from getting used to a project. Now, the hard part is understanding a project. I want to say like 99% of the effort is, do you have a good dev setup? Like, can you clone the project? Can you build the thing? Can you test the thing? And do you know roughly how it's constructed to know where to make the change? That is like all of the effort. Once you do that and you understand how the thing works, you can churn out features, fixes, whatever, much, much quicker. And so this is something that we're going to have to try, and you're going to try, and maybe it doesn't work out the first time or the second time or the 10th time, and that's totally okay. This is a learning process. Nobody is going to be like watching your GitHub and laughing at rejected PRs. Nobody is going to be doing the math. Nobody, like, your self-worth is not determined by how many like failed attempts you have to submit pull requests. As long as you're learning, that is the important thing. So it's okay to do this over and over again. Okay, we're going to talk about picking an issue really quick, and then we'll do a 15-minute break and then come back with our lab. I think it's 15 minutes, right? Okay, cool. So if you have a project or a project that you're interested in, the next thing to do is figure out, okay, what am I going to actually change about this? And you want to pick an issue. Best way to do that is to read issues. Read open issues, read closed issues, especially closed issues that are marked good first issue, and you'll be able to see, how people contributed, what the maintainers are expecting, how stringent their review process is, and how things go. So reading issues is super important. It'll give you an idea of the state of support for the project and get you used to how well the maintainers will respond. If you're looking for your first contribution, go small. Like, realistically, you're not going to go clone Firefox tomorrow and add like some large feature to it, right? You want to do something really minimal. Maybe it's like a comment change like I did my first time, or maybe it's something more substantive than that. But you want to remove the amount of barriers that it'll take. So if you're not learning a new language or a new platform and you're picking a small issue, you're much more likely to be successful and get your PR merged and released, which is the ultimate goal here. So you want to, yeah, figuratively, you want to hit the ground running and not get hung up on something complicated. Good first issue tags are a great place to start. They're not always well curated or not always good first issues, but it's a good thing to look for. GitHub has like labeling functionality that lets you look at issues by good first issues. This right here is a link to the blog post that BW was talking about earlier, about how the best first issue is one that you create yourself. I think that there is a lot of truth to that, and it's a really good advice. And I'd also encourage you not to get hung up on, like, if you can't create an issue yourself or can't find like a defect in the project that you want to fix, there's still an opportunity for you. You can pick something small and you can work up to something more substantive. If you're not comfortable making application changes, there's a couple ways you can go to contribute to the project. Maybe you're like really good at CI or like GitHub Actions, and you want to make sure that like the project has linting, the project is well formulated, the project doesn't have spelling mistakes. Like these are all things that you can check in an automated fashion and update. So I'll say like CI, linting, non-application stuff. The other big thing is docs. There is not a project in the world where the maintainer is satisfied with the state of the documentation of the project. A really good way to make friends is improving, like understanding a project and then improving the documentation around it. Like people were saying earlier in the keynotes, if you like clone a project, something doesn't work, something doesn't build on your machine, open an issue, improve the documentation around it, tell people how to get started, what dependencies are required. That is going to make you very, very popular in the open source world. Something like small as typo fixes, for example, is a great way to get used to contributing. So looking for issues marked documentation as a label is a good way to go about that. Documentation label. Okay, cool. We're going to pause here for our 11:30 break. Come back in like 15 minutes, and then we'll do our little walkthrough here and then talk about how to follow through on a pull request once you've opened it. Quick lab, if you have a computer, you're welcome and encouraged to follow along. If you don't, that's also totally cool. The goal here is we're going to do some very concrete steps for how to clone a repository, how to fork it, and how to like submit a PR. So if you're following along at the end of this, you will be a contributor to my dummy repo, and then you can just use those same mechanics to do your own thing. So I have this repository here called KF Campbell Demo Open Source 101 / my first contribution. If you go to this GitHub page and you have a GitHub account, that is what you need to be prepared for this. I wish I had this in a way that I could like send it out so you could just copy. Maybe I should have made the name shorter, I don't know. But please go to this page and then we will proceed. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about here is this concept of forking. Forking is something you can do to any open source project, and it's basically a copy of the repository that belongs to you instead of this organization here that I've created, KF Campbell Demo Open Source 101. You're going to do this in every project that you contribute to, and the way that you do that is click fork, this button here in the upper right, and I'm logged in as myself here, KF Campbell, and so it's going to take this repository, my first contribution, and give me a copy of it. You want to accept the defaults here, description, who cares, and we want to copy the main branch only. In this repo, there's not other branches, but that's you usually won't need to copy anything other than the main. So I'm going to click Create Fork, and we're going to let GitHub churn for a little bit. And you can see up here that the owner's changed. It's taken me to my personal page, and then my first contribution here. And then it shows, hey, this is forked from KF Campbell Open Source, or Demo Open Source 101 / my first contribution. Has anyone been able to fork this? Has anyone gotten to that page? Is that better? This is KF Campbell demo open source 101 / my first contribution. I'll write it here if that helps. Okay, this is a K, not an R. Dash demo dash open dash source dash 101 / my first contribution. So the way you get here is github.com / this stuff. Again, sorry for making everyone type that out. Oops. Hey, somebody forked this. That's great.
Just a quick reminder, you won't be able to see changes if somebody forks it, right?
I will.
Oh, you will, okay.
Unless you make your fork private, but by default it's public if you're forking a public thing. It's not like if you make changes to your own forked repo, it doesn't notify me, but I can go browse and look at it. And then if you open a PR, then it will notify me and I'll look at it. Okay, cool. So once you have this thing forked, you can go to code and then click copy this link. And this is how you open, pull the project and clone it down. So I'm going to make a temp directory here because I'm going to delete this later. And I'm going to run git clone and then paste that link in. And that is how you pull the code down from GitHub onto your local machine. I have some authentication set up here. You don't need authentication unless you're pushing code from to a repository, but like, excuse me, you can pull public stuff without authentication. So if we list the stuff here, we see that I have this directory called my first contribution. And then I'm going to use VS Code as my editor just because that's what I like and that's what I'm comfortable with. Let me see if I can zoom in. Okay, cool. Hopefully that's legible to everyone. This repository is very blank. There's a README that just says my first contribution. There's a contributing.md document. This is super important. Anytime you look at a new project, you should read the README and read the contributing.md, and that'll give you advice on how to get started. So here this says, if you don't have a GitHub account, sign up. You can create a personal access token that'll give you permission to push. And then there's some instructions on how to run git clone. And then there's instructions on how to make and submit a pull request, which we're going to do momentarily. So we're going to skip me reading this. If the project is complicated, they're going to have their own setup here. Maybe you need to install dependencies. Maybe you need to, I don't know, run other programs at the same time. The contributing.md and the README are where you're going to learn about that. It's super important to read those for any open source contribution you want to make. All right, so what we're going to be doing here, this ends at what, 12:15? Okay, cool. I'll try and speed this up here. I created this example.txt file, and what I'd like you all to do if you're following along is create another file with your username. So I'm going to do kfcampbell.txt here, and then just put something in the file. It doesn't really matter what it is. You can put whatever you want. I'm going to put username, kfcampbell, and something I learned. Technical difficulties make it hard to predict timing because we're running a little bit late here. Okay, great. So if you just edit this file, throw any garbage you want in there, we're less concerned about the application here than the mechanics of doing it at this point. And then we're going to go back to the terminal. If you run git status, it'll show you, hey, you added a file here, submissions.kfcampbell.txt that doesn't exist in the what's called the upstream or the remote. And the code, so what I'm going to run is git add and then give the file name here. And what that does is stages it for commit. So if I run git status, it says, hey, if you're going to run commit, we have this new file right here. Cool. So then in order to commit this, I run git commit -m, and I put some kind of message here. I'm actually not going to put that. I'm going to put like add @KF Campbell to submissions. Some kind of short but reasonably descriptive message that someone will be able to look at. And once that's committed, it's on my machine locally, but it is not up on GitHub yet. In order to do that, I have to run git push, and now it'll go up to KF Campbell / my first contribution. So if I go back to GitHub here and I reload the page, it says this branch is one commit ahead. Oh, I meant to check out a branch. Oh well, that's not important. So it'll say this branch is one commit ahead of the repository that I'm forked from, and it'll give this handy button to open a pull request. And if you've gotten this far, I would love if you create a pull request, and I'll approve it and add you to, or add your submission to this application. So a pull request will give you a couple options. You have a title, you have some description. Normally this would be a nice description of the change, why you're changing stuff, and how you changed stuff. Also, things that are good to address here, address documentation changes and what was I saying? Oh, testing changes here is another good thing to address. When you're submitting a PR, most of the time you won't have control of like projects or milestones. You can add labels if you'd like. None of these, or the default labels don't really apply here. So it's okay to just click create here. If you scroll down, you want to make sure that allow edits by maintainers. This is like a big personal thing of mine. I hate when people submit PRs but don't let me edit it. A lot of the time there's just like a little typo or like something really small that's getting in the way of me merging your thing. But if I can't just like merge it and do that right away, then I have to wait for you. I have to ask, wait for someone else to change it, wait for that to be pushed up. It just lengthens the time to get the PR approved. So please allow edits by maintainers, and then click create pull request. Nice. Okay, so now we have a fancy pull request here. One thing to note is this blue text shows you where it's coming from. It'll say into this, which is the original owner, KF Campbell demo open source 101 from the main branch, and then from my personal fork. My personal account is KF Campbell. Yours will obviously be something different when you go through this. You will not see this green thing. I am an owner on the original repo, so you won't be able to merge it. That is like a permissions thing that I will do for your PR. And in this case, I'm just going to click merge. Boom. Okay, that is like the simplest possible workflow for contributing to open source. You need to clone the project down to your machine. You need to make your changes. You need to commit your changes. You need to push your changes, and then open the pull request. And then we can see on the original one, KF Campbell demo open source, we can see submissions. We have example and kfcampbell.txt here. Yeah. Yeah, of course. You need to fork the project. You need to clone your fork. You need to make your changes and commit them. Then push your changes up, and then open the pull request. And this is going through like the life cycle of the pull request stuff that we discussed earlier. Great. So if I look at pull requests here, if any of these come in from you guys, I'll go ahead and like merge it in. What's up? Can I show my what? Oh yeah, of course. Here. So from the very beginning, I ran git clone. I changed my directory into the project directory. I opened VS Code, which is where I made my changes. You know, maybe you want to use Vim or Emacs or Sublime Text or whatever your personal text editor of choice is. That doesn't matter. I ran git status to see this new file. Yep. Then I ran git add and added that file. I have this habitual thing where I run git status like all the time to see what's going on. Maybe you're more confident than me and you don't have to do that constantly. But I do that still. And then git commit, -m is a flag for message. If you just run git commit, it'll bring up like a prompt where you type the message, but this is a quick thing. I'm going to just add it here. And then git push. And that will push your project up to your fork. That's when you go to GitHub and you open the PR, or whatever your source control of choice is.
Was there any authorization set? Because it's saying while doing the git push, it's saying that the push is being denied. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So this is something I didn't, I have authentication set up on my machine. In order to push something to GitHub, it has to know like who you are and that you have permissions. So the easiest way to do that is to go to your settings, then go to developer settings, and then go to personal access tokens, and then tokens classic. And then you want to generate a new token. Here. Give it a name, give it some permissions. Repo is the only one you'll need for this. And then, this is going to show my token on screen, so I'm not going to give it any permissions. And I'm going to revoke it right away. But then it'll give you this right here. And then you can export this in your terminal. Or when you run git push, it'll ask for like your username and your password. Put your username or whatever, and then use the token as the password. There's a way that like I've configured where you can set this up so your machine just knows and it doesn't have to ask you every time. The first time you're doing it, it'll ask for that username and password. The token is the password. Don't use your GitHub password because it won't work. That threw me for a loop the first time I figured this out. Okay. Yeah, it's like a security thing, I think. You shouldn't be using your password as the thing for everything. Okay, cool. That concludes that. Let me look at the content we have, because we only have 10 more minutes, and I'd like to do a few questions. And then give out some stickers. Come on. Okay. I'm going to bring the iPad back up here. Cool. All right. Let's do some quick discussion about what maintainers want to see. Completed homework. This is just like read the contributing.md. Make sure that like, I don't know, this isn't necessarily software advice. This is just advice, period. It's easier to help people who have helped themselves by doing like the basic stuff. If you ask a question and you didn't read the contributing.md, chances are the maintainer's going to be like, go read this and then come back and ask me a better question. Yes?
So only the maintainer really writes the contributing.md? Like we just need to read it, but when we do a pull request, we don't edit anything on that?
Unless there's something that you notice that's like deficient in there, like it doesn't have a step you want, then you can submit a PR to change that, of course. Normally, it's like a maintainer's thing where they're giving you the guide for how to contribute. And it's, again, totally okay to edit that, but normally your changes won't. Cool, yeah, so do your homework, write a PR description. Nothing is worse than when you look at a PR and it's like got nothing there. And you want to provide some amount of information about that. So use that. One thing that maintainers really want to see, if you ask questions, especially around docs and testing, that's a really good indication that you're like doing your homework and that you'll follow up. Please, please, please ask questions. It shows engagement and it shows that you care. Yes?
How do you ask questions?
In the PR description is what I'm saying. Or you can create the PR and then go like, where was my, okay, then you can just go down here and say like, hey, this isn't tested. What's up with that? Or like, how would I go about testing that? And then you can just comment. The PR, or in GitHub, your PR will have this record of all the comments. Every other source control system will also have that. There's like a way to track a conversation.
So is it acceptable to make a PR that's just a comment, just a question?
In that case, I would create an issue.
Okay.
Pull request, you want to have like some sort of concrete change. I don't think GitHub will let you open a PR if there's no difference, like in the application. Edits allowed, we discussed this. Just check the checkbox, it makes everyone's life easier. And then ask about tests. If there's no testing, ask about it. If there is testing, look at like, a good strategy is to just follow the pattern. A lot of open source is like pattern matching. Generally, you're not going to contribute to a project and like introduce a completely different testing framework or like do something completely different. So you want to look at some other functionality that's kind of similar to yours and then see how they tested that, use the same library, like put the stuff in the similar area. So follow the pattern within reason, of course. Like that's what you should do. Okay. Following up on PRs, please be nice. Nobody wants to be the bad guy to like lock comments or delete them. I've done that and I just feel crappy about myself every time. Consider enabling notifications. Your time is important, but like GitHub also has, like if you're really on the edge of your seat, GitHub has a notifications platform you can use. Like if you have the mobile app or want to check github.com/notifications. Give it some time. A lot of these people do it like on their own time or nights and weekends, or maybe they're just super busy at work and you don't want to submit a PR and like 5 hours later be like, hey, when can this go in? Be patient, give it a little bit of time. After a few days, you can poke them, like give them an app mention, maybe comment like as a follow-up, like, hey, does this need anything else before you look at it? I think this is ready for review, blah, blah, blah. It's okay to gently poke people. Take their advice within reason. Like don't do dumb stuff, but you want to show that you can work in a team and like collaborate in an asynchronous manner. Multiple rounds of review is totally okay and normal. Reread the entire PR when responding. If it's something like really simple, that's not necessary, but it's very common for me where I'll be working with someone on a PR and then I'll go comment on it and then like the answer is up there in a previous comment or like I'm missing some context. It just helps if you, I don't know, make sure you know what you're talking about before you start talking. Maybe that's not helpful advice. And then be kind again. There are humans on the other side. People are just normal and tired and stuff happens. So be nice to them. Okay, in conclusion, open source is great for a lot of reasons. You can give back to the community, you can be selfish and just work on yourself through it. Picking a project, getting set up, understanding the project, this is like everything. This is something that you're gonna have to do a whole bunch of times before you find something that sticks. We did this little lab on the process of contribution and we talked about following up. So thanks for coming and sitting here. I'm gonna hang out for a few more minutes and ask questions. I also stole a bunch of stickers from the GitHub security desk, so please come grab a couple stickers.